It's time to talk about Ether Tokyo Drift.
Yes. At some point, you have to just start editing these sound effects in.
Distraction makers.
Mark Rosario just came out with an episode on his Drive to Work podcast talking about Aetherdrift, but it was literally
2 years ago.
Yeah, it was two. He recorded it 2 years ago.
Yeah.
To get initial reactions for handing the set over from vision to set design.
Right. He had that day just handed it over to set design, recorded what they handed over and what their work was on the set. And then 2 years later, we're now hearing about it, which is super cool. I really hope that he keeps making podcast episodes like that.
So we're going to talk a little bit about where the set was when Mark handed it off to set design. And then we're going to talk a bit about where the set is today. Hey, Forrest, tell me about your new website.
Okay. I have a new website called Void Monster, where every month I will have limited runs of trading card game inspired accessories and apparel. And this month I have my Tiamat playmat. Hopefully it's on screen. Yeah,
check it out. Woo. You can get it until this Sunday.
You can get it until February 9th. So if you're interested, you want to go check it out, I'll have new stuff every month. But you can find more info on voidmonster.org.
All right, back to the video. But yeah, let's start with where the set was when Mark handed it off. He mentioned that they had 3 design pillars.
Yeah, I don't know if it was design overall, over the entirety of the project, or mechanical pillars that specifically R&D was trying to capture in their development.
So yeah, for me, when I go to write design pillars, it's more like these are things that are going to encompass the intended experience by the end of it. And so the 3 pillars that he had were that there's a race, that there are vehicles, and there's fuel. Those were the 3 big things they wanted to make sure were in the set to make sure they were getting the vibe correct.
He did also mention that there was some talks of not just a race, but also a tour across multiple planes.
Yeah.
And so that was actually an idea for a separate set by the sounds of it, but they sort of merged these 2 ideas and thought, well, what if the race takes place over multiple planes?
Yeah. Yep.
So
the initial mechanics that they sort of passed over to set design were a race mechanic, which was essentially what we have now.
Is start your engines.
Start your engines. But initially it was pitched as a race where lap 1, lap 2, lap 3, but each of those were sort of in different planes is how they had envisioned it.
Yeah, it seems like it was similar, close to the One Ring, where it'd be an extra bit of cruft on the side. It'd be an extra card that sort of tracks your position in the race. Basically.
Not the One Ring, the ring tempts you.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Sorry, the ring tempts you.
Yeah, right. Which there still is a card that tracks what your speed is. But they were envisioning this more like it was laps or something, right? Like lap 1, lap 2, lap 3, and then and then when you finished the race in lap 3, if you were the first one to finish it, you got a reward and also treasure. I guess they were thinking they were cards attached to this mechanic, but also the mechanic itself had a reward for finishing it, which was getting a treasure per player who hasn't finished the race yet.
Right.
Including yourself. So you would get one for yourself.
Right. So it's very similar to the current mechanic. So start your engines now is if you have no speed, it starts at 1. It increases once on each of your turns when an opponent loses life, and the max speed is 4. And then pretty much every card that has a start your engines mechanic has some sort of a bonus when you reach max speed.
So the next one is vehicles, and those ended up just in the set as vehicles. There's also saddle or mechanic.
Yeah.
Which he mentioned was actually made for this set first and then ended up going into Cowboys of Thunder Junction.
Outlaws of Thunder Junction. And I mean, it sounds like their overall pillar here was just it's the set that will have the most vehicles.
You have to have vehicles. And then the last pillar was fuel, which they had pitched as energy. And bringing energy back into this set, but this mechanic ended up as exhaust.
Exhaust says activate each exhaust ability only once. And I'll reserve my opinions for later.
This one's interesting. We'll come back to that. I guess cycling ended up in the set too.
Right.
There's a few other mechanics that showed up too.
Yeah, some of the other mechanics that they had talked about adding in, there was Tour. The way that Tour worked, you look at the top card of your deck. If it's a land, you can choose to reveal it. If you do, you put it on the bottom of your deck and you can repeat that process.
Yeah.
And then at the end, or otherwise you just draw it.
So you're basically saying I get to filter my draws as long as I'm drawing land.
Right, as
I
long
can
as it's
choose
land.
to draw land or not.
Right.
And then if I don't want to draw land, I have to draw the first thing that isn't land.
Right. There was also another mechanic related to this that was like maybe it was tied to having different lands of different names. And they said that was a little too easy and constructed to get the benefits of.
The last mechanic that they pitched was
Speedy. Yes.
Which basically was just things that interacted with flash and haste creatures. Right?
It was like
Bonuses
what
for those?
Outlaws is. So Outlaws is now, it's a what's the name of it? It's not
super type?
It's super type. Yeah.
I don't know.
So it encompasses all things with haste and flash are considered speedy.
Are considered speedy.
Yeah.
Oh.
And then they were going to play off of that.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay, well, those didn't make it across the finish line.
Wow. Whoa. Racing!
Tour ultimately became cycling. I think we didn't mention that.
Right. Yes.
You're right.
Yeah,
It just became regular cycling, which I think was probably a good choice. But let's go back to race. The race mechanic, which became start your engines in the finished set. The biggest difference here for me, design-wise, is that the original design intent that I keyed in on for race was that it focused very much on the actual race itself. It was really trying to evoke these feelings that you're racing each other and there's a finish line and there's laps basically.
Even regardless of whether your opponent has cards that engage in the race, they are entering the race because there is a time limit that is now imposed on it. There technically is that with max speed in a way, but I feel like something about the additional treasures on top of that, like, I don't know, there's something about it that just makes it feel a little bit more visceral, engaging.
Right. Well, and like I like the idea, right, exactly like you're saying, right, where we're introducing this mechanic into the game that now other players are able to participate in, whether or not they have cards that care about it. Let's check the race thing. There's no bonus. There's no bonus for finishing it now, right?
No, you hit max speed. So when you hit max speed, if there's a card that you have,
it turns your cards on.
Your cards, yes, get activated basically.
Yeah, I think my biggest problem here is that like in the original intent is right. You're like you're starting a sub game, which is we're racing now.
Yeah.
And it pushes aggression, which it does now too, right? Like you deal damage, that's how you go up to max speed. But there's nothing to like incentivize the other players, like assuming this is commander or whatever, to like deal damage to go up into max speed if they don't have any cards that care about max speed.
Right. Yeah.
There's nothing.
It doesn't affect anyone else's plan.
Okay, so the start your engines card, right? So the thing that tracks how fast you're going, says whenever an opponent loses life during your turn, your speed is 1. If your speed is 1 or greater, increase your speed by 1. Max speed is 4. This ability triggers only once each turn. So you basically have to play a start your engines card to bring this into the game, right?
Okay.
It's the same thing with the day-night cycle. So you bring this into the game. So whenever an opponent loses life on your turn, you increase your speed. You can only increase your speed once each turn.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter if you have a creature then again that starts its engine. It's like once you've started your engines, you start them once, and then once they're started, now you're off. You're in this race.
Okay.
And then that interacts with any of the other cards that have a max speed bonus. So I do think. Okay. So I did mention that I like the idea that you introduce this new sub game, right? And now you're racing, right?
Yeah.
So you might not win it, right? Other opponents can win it before you, even though you introduced it in the previous design.
Yeah.
Right. The issue though is that you could end up with the enter the dungeon problem, which is that you could have cards that you play just to start the mechanic.
Yeah.
This is the problem with White Plume Adventure and why it ultimately got banned in Legacy, is that you would only play it to like start this process of gaining extra value, and like you weren't it didn't really matter, right? It was like I played this card once, and if it comes into play again, I get to venture into the Undercity again. So there was a lot of like knock-on effects that like sort of got out of hand with all this extra value. So I wonder if they were a little like gun shy on that kind of mechanic, which the way that the Vision design team handed off the race mechanic, it could have ended up that way, right? Where I'm going to introduce this race with this card that like I don't really care about it beyond that.
Yeah.
And then I'm just going to try to win the race to get a bunch of extra mana.
Yeah,
Right?
that's true.
I like the idea of the sub game much more. than what they ended up with, because what they ended up with is sort of like, all right, well, I'm going to start my engines. You don't really care whether or not I did that. And then I effectively just sort of like have a kicker where once I get to speed 4, now my stuff is powered up.
Yeah, I think that in general, the concept of just getting to max speed, but not necessarily seeing that like purpose of getting to max speed,
right?
is
It's
kind
like
of,
a flavor fail.
Yeah,
like,
to me, I think that's kind of, it's probably going to be my feedback kind of across the board. But a lot of this feels like the initial intent was very flavorful. That like, yeah, definitely there could be issues with it down the road. Potentially, right? But I guess to me, if I'm looking at the set and I'm looking at max speed and I'm thinking like, I'm always thinking like, how can someone fulfill the fantasy, right? And the fantasy is death race, but there's no cards that are referencing like winning a race necessarily, right? You're getting to max speed because you should have max speed on your
really
cards.
fast.
You're going really fast.
Yeah, I do think that they lost something there. In terms of like, and it might have been the thing that I'm talking about where they're adjusting power level stuff, but I do feel like they kind of lost the sub game that was evoking the race, right? Okay, so we're gonna skip over vehicles because they didn't change anything. They're just vehicles and saddle
Yeah.
So let's talk about fuel, right? And Vision had passed this off as, or passed it over to the set design as just energy. Which I think is fine that they changed.
It's funny because Mark actually had predicted that if they remove energy, it's probably because it will be coming out in a set around this time or recently, and that's what happened, is that energy just got brought back in Modern Horizons 3, right?
Yeah. And again, there's sort of some problems with it. So I could... Energy's weird for me. I don't really think it's a particularly great mechanic because it feels like it breaks stuff every time it shows up, mainly because it's a resource that gives you value without operating through the normal channels of how that works, which is your mana. So I'm pretty iffy on energy in general, but, my opinion doesn't matter that much. So I can see why that, again, energy's already in Modern Horizons 3. It has its, host of problems, and now they went with something called exhaust.
Yeah. And exhaust, I mean, it's not even sort of a secondary resource. I guess it kind of is in a way.
It's just a creature ability that you can just use once per game. Sort of. And I remember reading this, and me with my layman's inexperience of Magic, I was like, oh, you just have to remember that you use that ability once in the game. And you told me like, no, you can use that multiple times. It's once per instance of the creature.
Which is too complicated to write on the card.
Well, no, that's not, that's like a rules... exploit sort of, right? So there's all these cards that like trigger once per turn or whatever, but you can actually do it more than once per turn because you can, if you bounce the creature and it comes back into play again, it's a new instance of that creature. If you play a creature with exhaust, use its ability, bounce it, it comes back into play again, you can then use it again. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. So like it sounds like this huge big limitation, but like in reality, it doesn't pay off that way. That's going to be very confusing to newer players.
Yeah, I can absolutely see new players reading that mechanic and not understanding that nuance whatsoever, and it not being intuitive. And in fact, there's even cards. I'm looking at Afterburner Expert here. And Afterburner Expert, I think, goes along with the idea of expecting you to understand that rule. And it's whenever you activate an exhaust ability, return this card from your graveyard to the battlefield, and it has its own exhaust ability.
Okay.
And so, like, obviously, at some point, they're expecting you to be able to exhaust, maybe remove it, bring it back by activating another exhaust and activate its exhaust again. But like, if you don't understand that as a player, I feel like
I already did it. Yeah.
Right. I feel like that's a kind of a deep rule to understand as a player. I'm not new to this game by any means, but I didn't totally understand that's how that would function.
And the biggest like hiccup here is it says on the card
only once.
Right. But it doesn't actually mean only once.
Right. Otherwise they'd say only once per game.
Yeah.
But even then that doesn't matter, right?
Right.
Based off of their rules.
Even once per game wouldn't matter.
Right.
Yeah.
So to me, I feel like it's pretty unintuitive. Yeah. And it doesn't exactly have the same flavor that like a secondary resource like energy would have, feeling wise, right? Like that is a much more evocative feeling of feeling like you were burning through fuel or using exhaust in some way, right? And when I see this ability, I'm like, well, that has no feeling. And when it doesn't have a feeling, I don't understand the intention behind it.
Flavor is really important for helping players intuitively understand what mechanics are supposed to be doing. So when your sort of flavor and mechanical expressions don't line up in an intuitive way, you just are sort of asking players to memorize the thing. Yeah. So exhaust and what it does, to me, doesn't really line up flavor-wise. I don't think people are going to have that hard of a time like remembering it, but I think the initial, like, what does exhaust do? There isn't like almost like a flavor mnemonic device to help you remember what it does. Tracking whether or not you've used these abilities is a big problem in tabletop, in paper, especially in a competitive environment. I get, like, you can write down that they were used, but if, like, you've used it, you've written it down, the creature's been bounced, it comes back, you can do it again, you tap it again, you're note taking every time something like this happens to make sure that your opponent doesn't do it multiple times.
So a couple other mechanics, obviously we're not going to bring up, we're not talking too deeply about vehicles and saddle and all that stuff. But one is they brought back affinity for artifacts, which is interesting, to say the least. And they brought back, they have one card with landfall. Not sure why one in the set has landfall. And then cycling, which I think we mentioned a little bit. Yeah. But cycling was sort of the replacement for that tour mechanic that R&D was trying to work in, which I think cycling is obviously, like, that was the mechanical function of what they were trying to go for with the touring and going through the deck in a way. But I do kind of wish that cycling is just such a non-flavorful mechanic that...
What are you talking about? There's cycles in this set.
You're right. And they don't do anything like what the mechanic cycling does. Now, if they let's see, did they put cycling on all the motorcycles?
Oh,
that would be better.
That'd be funny.
No.
Oh.
No, they didn't. I just missed the flavor. And something about when Mark was kind of describing, like, what their the race mechanic was initially going to be, I was like, that makes sense. I hear that flavor and I go, oh, you're entering a race. Everyone else is sort of entering this race, and you get this, like, trophy at the end. And everyone else gets trophies relative to when they finish the race. And, like, to me, I'm like, that sounds fun. That sounds flavorful, exciting. Again, I understand why there's complications with that. Like you're saying, you're going to have something just activate it, and then you're just going to race to that point, and you're going to get you're going to get a bunch of mana, basically. And there's ways of, I guess, exploiting that. But something that I think this set just kind of was a reminder for me when I'm looking at newer Magic sets, I keep feeling like I'm wishing that these sort of parasitic designs would come back, these parasitic mechanics. Mechanics that are more isolated to these specific sets, but are more flavorful because they know that even if this mechanic were used in an alternative format or outside of limited or constructed in the current standard rotation, it might break the game, but here it's okay.
Right. Yeah. I think this is, I mean, we probably won't get too deep into this in this episode in particular, but I do think this is a little bit of a consequence of trading card games versus living card games, right?
Sure.
Where, like, a living card game, you can sort of say, okay, if you're more focused on, like, all right, well, this is this expansion, these are the mechanics. In a living card game, I can ensure that players will have access to all of the sort of parasitic design cards, rather than saying, like, okay, you have to get these through boosters. You're only going to have some of them, and the ones you get, if you get one half and not the other, it's like non-functional. Where in, like, a living card game, you're getting the whole set at once. And so, you know, we're seeing this pop up again and again with modern Magic design, is that they are very reluctant to do anything that is particularly parasitic. And we've talked about this a little bit before, where parasitic design is one of the ways that, like, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has helped elongate its life cycle in an eternal format. Right. So this is something that they might inevitably have to start looking at and thinking more about to elongate the game's lifespan now that it exists in almost an entirely eternal world.
I think it's funny because they're avoiding parasitic design to make sure that sets are still enticing to commander format and commander players.
Well, and there's an argument to be made, you know, when I talk about, like, designing a card is sort of like designing a Lego piece in that, like, okay, well, you kind of need bricks to be able to go in different, builds so that you can make different stuff. And if you have like, a windshield can basically just be a windshield or something, right? Like there's specific Lego pieces that like don't work well as multiple different things. And in a, TCG environment, if you have a card that only works with a subset of other cards, not only are you sort of like forcing players to build decks a particular way, you're also ensuring that, those cards just don't have a whole lot of plugs, right? Stuff for other stuff to plug into.
And it's not until other sets explore that. And that's why we see now a boom in energy decks and Commander.
Yeah.
And
now that energy's back.
There's one more thing for this set that we need to talk about.
What's that?
Vanillas.
My man.
Vanilla creatures are having their moment. All right?
Very brief, and
Look,
no one cares. But we do.
I don't think no one cares. Look,
We care.
Have you read some of these?
No.
All right. 1 and a blue, 0/8 legendary octopus creature.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a beefy boy. He's got a dumper.
2 and 3 green. All right.
Uh-huh.
For a 9/7.
That's big.
That's big. That's a
big
big boy.
Yeah.
We got a 1 and a red. It's a 4/1.
4/1 for 2 mana.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm into it. All right. That's all I'm saying.
So the reason why these vanillas are all here is because one of the planes that is being featured in this set is a Vanilla Matters plane. Muraganda.
Yeah. Previously only had 3 cards that actually ever mentioned creatures with no abilities. And now they are officially exploring that plane, which I'm very excited about.
Well, you got a bunch of new creatures for your Vanilla Matters deck.
I do. I have a couple, yes. One thing I will say, though, is that as much as I'm very, very excited for vanilla creatures having their comeback, why this set?
I don't know, dude.
Like, it's a whole racing death race set, and I'm looking at all the vanilla creatures cards, and I'm like, you're not even relevant right now. You're just in there. There are some cards here that, like, I think there's a tutor, so you can go and grab a vanilla creature from your deck. So that's cool. I'm glad they started implementing that. But yeah, as far as the race goes, I don't think it's relevant whatsoever. But I want a whole Muraganda set now.
It's not going to happen.
I want it to happen.
I think you're just memeing now.
Nope. I want a whole Muraganda set. I want to know what that looks like. How do you make that work?
You don't.
How do you make it work? Thanks for listening to us talk about Aetherdrift for a little while. If you enjoyed the video, please feel free to give us a little like and subscribe. Maybe even comment down below. Also, we have a Discord. If you want to join that, you can find a link to that in the description down below.
We'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.
Made it to the finish line.
Doesn't matter if you win by an inch or a mile. Winning's winning.
It's about family.
Granny shifting, not double clutching like you should.